We have a treat today, you guys. We really do. Roy Searle comes to us via Zoom, live on Zoom from England, and we're thrilled to have him with us. Roy's story, which I'm going to get him to share just very briefly in a minute, is that after coming to faith, he planted a church, moved on to being a large church pastor, then to being a denominational leader, then to being a community leader, then to a lecturer, a writer. He's done it all. He's done so many things, and he comes to us with just such a wealth of experience in so many different areas. But there's much better stories than that. One of the things we'll talk a little bit about today is his experience with the Northumbrian community. Some of you may be familiar with that community in some of the work that they've done around daily offices. Particularly, Roy's done lots of work with Celtic spirituality and Celtic daily prayer. He's the husband of one wife, Shirley, father of 4 kids and 5 grandkids. And, I've gotten to know Roy a little bit more, even during this time of COVID. I knew of him, had probably bumped into him once or twice prior. But I think the only bad thing I can say about Roy is that he's a Middlesbrough supporter. I know there's baseball and football stuff going back and forth, but if you're from England, it's soccer, it's football. And so, Roy, I'm sorry that you have to support Middlesbrough, but I couldn't find anything else bad to say about you. You've encouraged me in so many ways personally, and now I'm thrilled that you're here with us overall today and with this NAB family that I'm part of. So bless you, and thank you for coming to do this. Hey, I've given just a little quick snapshot. Can you fill in some of the details? Tell us a little bit about, some people will know you, but not everybody on the call will know you. Tell us a little bit of the details of who you are and a little bit of your journey.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you just for this opportunity. It's a joy and privilege to be with you. And I think at this time when the world is being shaken, hearts and hands across our continents is a really critical thing as we dialogue and share together. I'm just a fellow pilgrim, somebody who's plodding hopefully in the right direction, who loves God and desires to live out his good news in the world. I come to you as no expert whatsoever. That introduction was just a lot of flannel, really. And let me explain about Middlesbrough. Somebody has to support them. I've always had a heart for the marginalised and the poor, and it's actually heightened my belief in purgatory, being a Middlesbrough supporter. So there we go. I'm mindful of C.S. Lewis, the writer, who said, please don't regard me as an expert, but having been around the hospital ward a little longer than most of you, I can offer a little bit of advice. So I share with you out of my own journey of faith. I actually come from an unchurched background. I wasn't brought up in the church. I came to faith while training to be an outward bound instructor in the Cairngorms of Scotland. And I was called to the ministry on a beach on the northeast coast of Northumbria. And it's a great kind of irony, or is it paradox, that I ended up a minister of the gospel within the church. My wife and I went off to Bible college. Actually, Cam, since last we spoke, but I need to update you. We now have 7 grandchildren.
Oh, wow.
It's one of life's great blessings, but we now have 7 grandchildren. Okay. Of course, with lockdown, we can't see any of them at the moment, but that's another story. My wife and I went to Bible college, where there was a great emphasis, and appreciating that we were fairly young believers, on 2 major things: spiritual formation and mission. I mean, to be honest, a lot of the academic stuff was pretty rubbish, but 40 years on in ministry, I give thanks to God for godly men and women who mentored us in spiritual formation, to love God and to love our neighbour. I went on to university then, as you said. I pioneered and planted a church on an urban housing estate in an area of much poverty and deprivation, with over 50% unemployment. And then the minister of a large charismatic evangelical church, the biggest one in the northeast of England. And then 30 years ago, with a few other people, we founded what is known as the Northumbria community, a new monastic community. We found it with no vision, no strategy, no idea what we were doing. It was founded basically on a few people who were asking questions about We're singing songs of revival, but it feels more like exile. We actually are talking about church planting and church growth, but the reality is when we step outside of our church culture, there's a secular mindset and a growing post-Christendom society coming all around us. And we were asking questions, who do we seek? To be honest, we had created God in our own image to validate our own way of doing things in the church and spirituality. So the community was founded on questions. Who we're seeking, how do we sing the Lord's song of Strange Land, which is a song of exile, and really how then shall we live? How can we follow Jesus in a changing world? I am very committed. I'm an ordained Baptist minister. I teach in an Anglican and Baptist college. I was president of the Baptist Union of Great Britain. I had the joy of being the president during the Baptist World Alliance Centenary Congress during my year of presidency, which was in Birmingham here in the UK. I teach at Durham and at London, and I met many Canadians and folks from the States when I was a visiting lecturer at the International Baptist Theological Seminary in Prague, which I miss greatly. It's since shifted over. I now write, I mentor, and as my prayer accompanies say, I take tea as well. Tea is teaching, encouraging, and advising. I'm a northerner, that's important for you to know. There is a difference, for those of you who've not been to the UK, there's a difference between the north and the south. So I'm a cultured northerner, and I'm married, as you've said, with 4 children and now 7 grandchildren. Is that enough, Cam?
That's wonderful. But tell us a little bit more, Roy, about the Northumbrian community. What kinds of things, what does life look like in community with you guys in these days?
Well, out of our questions and explorations all those years ago, and the sense that we were, giving permission to ask questions that not too many people were asking around in the church at that time, we've explored those foundational questions, which I've just mentioned about seeking God, the monastic call. The first thing, what the monastics talk about as the one thing necessary in our lives is to seek God. And then we're asking, how do we then live? We're a geographically dispersed community, which means that there are companions and friends of the community literally all over the world, including in the United States and in Canada, other parts of the world. We covenanted together within the love of Christ. So when we're not church in the local ecclesial sense, we're a Christian community, aligned, if you like, with the new monastic movement that's emerged over the last 20, 30 years. And we've embraced a rule of life. And our rule of life is basically characterized by 2 terms: a call to availability and vulnerability. So available to God in the place of the cell of our own hearts, available to God through the exercise of hospitality to others, available to prayer and intercession, available to wandering for the love of Christ wherever the Father leads, which is a very Celtic thing. The Celtic saints were very inspirational to us because as we literally walked the ancient paths of Northumbria and Ireland and Scotland, we were discovering the stories of the men and women of faith who brought Christianity to our shores and shaped so much of European civilization with the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we draw a lot of inspiration from the Celts and also from the desert tradition, desert fathers and mothers, who were the big influence upon the Celtic saints. What do? We have companions and friends across the world who are trying to live out this rule of life, trying to seek God, live out the gospel, be good news in the different contexts in which God has placed us. We have a mother house in Northumberland. There are other houses. You've referred, Cam, already to Celtic Daily Prayer, which is translated into various languages now and reached all quarters of the world, really. I would say as a community, we occupy what some would describe as a liminal place. There's a recognition that where we have been as a church and Christian communities is no longer. It's a dying culture. We're not actually sure what the future holds. So we're living in this liminal, in-between place. And what I find fascinating is that God has often, by his Spirit, raised up monastic movements during periods of significant change within the world and the church. And, notably, somebody who's regarded as the father of modern monasticism. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor and theologian, that in the 1930s Germany, with all the emergence of nationalism and, the kind of just alienating anybody who didn't toe the line, which started with trade unionists and then the Jews and all that followed afterwards. Dietrich Bonhoeffer felt something of the call of God within him, where the church was becoming complicit and allied to the Third Reich and Hitler, to say, actually, let's look again at the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus is calling us to. And so at the seminary in Finkenwald, he founded a new monastic community. And he talked about the need of a new monasticism, which only has in common with the old an uncompromising allegiance to the Sermon on the Mount. High time men and women did this. And he talked about those things that would contribute to the renewal of the church. So I think Northumbria community, in some ways, has been raised up by God. I mean, we're not grand, we're just ordinary people, we're a bunch of people who've got more questions than we've got answers. But we have grown across the world with those questions. And I think we've made a little contribution to the renewal of the church, or as somebody who's committed to missiology, to reimagining of church and society through the good news.
Roy, thanks. Fantastic. It gives us a great foundation. Can I turn to you? Lay a foundation for us for what this conversation is going to be like today.
Well, first, I mostly would just like to hear Roy keep talking about Northumbria for the next hour and want to book my plane tickets and go live there for the rest of my life and or live it out here. It's just that speaking about it being becoming a non-anxious presence in the world where we demonstrate the reality of Christ among us by the disciplined life we have together versus being, as is so common, shaped and formed by the antagonisms and the meanness of this world. And it is definitely a foretaste of the kingdom of God and a place of shalom. And I find my heart thankful and being drawn to it. And so thanks for that, Roy. As we thought about the year of bonfire, we knew that this was simply one of the more difficult times, at least in recent memory, for the church. And so much dissension and so much pain, so much difficulty. And so we thought it would be good for us, perhaps, just since we can't have our other gatherings as easily, that we would just take a year and explore how to be with each other well during this time, how to have the words of God come to us, how to have our experiences shaped by God's perspective and increase in our compassion and our empathy, and to not be shaped by this difficulty. And so Roy's a great gift to us here. And today we're emphasizing our own personal souls. I mean, it's not that we're going to not do this continually, but this is where we want to give some energy to. So here's a kind of a open-ended question to ask of you, Roy, and if you would just play with us for this in a while. We know you live across the pond, but issues of the pandemic, racial unrest, all those things are occupying you guys over there. So to the degree you feel it's helpful to give some context there. But mostly we want to simply recognize the fact that it's pretty bad here. Every week, and this is literally and sometimes several times a week, and just yesterday, in fact, I'm talking to pastors who are saying things like, this is the worst 3 or 4 days of my life, or this has been the worst season of my entire ministry career. Pastors waking up saying, I don't want to do this anymore. Pastors waking up and leaders waking up saying, I don't like my church. And no-win situations being brought into a place where the hostility and the conflict, juiced up by all the language around us in the world, has taken its toll. And so there's a lot of discouragement, depression, disillusionment, And even as we've read some articles, pastors having suicidal iterations in the midst of all this. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot going on there. So Roy, I think if you would just take some time to expand on that, what is going on there? Obviously, the external pressures are extreme, but as our friend Stu Streeter likes to say, if the church is a tube of toothpaste, when the external pressures come on, what comes out is what was already in the toothpaste, so or in the tube. And so, what is that stuff? What is going on, and what's our major response? Not responsibility, but what do we need to attend to, and what do we need to do in this time? So, ramble away for a while there.
Wow. Okay, let me ramble away. I think, thank you for naming something, because for those of you who don't know what's going on here in the United Kingdom, we are in a serious, turbulent mess. We are in a crisis. And I would be saying to people, I feel a little bit like Jeremiah's contemporaries, you know, for his contemporaries were saying peace, peace, but Jeremiah is saying there is no peace. We're in a real serious situation here, and I don't think it's particularly related alone to Britain, but I think the Western world is in real difficulties. This pandemic has not taken God by surprise, so it's not unprecedented in the sight of God, but we've certainly never experienced anything like this before. And as we were saying a little earlier, we didn't get a course or a module on this when we were training for the ministry in our Bible colleges. As I ramble, I just want to share a little bit about the context, because I think it's important that we name some of the things that are happening and then begin to explore the impact that it has upon us personally, and then how we might respond alone, but also together. I think COVID-19 and the pandemic, and you know, I don't for one moment think that we're just going to be facing one pandemic. The history of the world will tell us that they come in series, and scientists are telling us that there are series of pandemics about to be faced. So I think what the pandemic has done has exposed our weaknesses. It's shone a light on those things that we'd rather not see, that have been brought to our attention, that have been forcibly come to us through COVID. And I think some of those things are really uncomfortable to name. Our dependency upon things, our occupation with things that actually, in the light of God, we've probably focused on either too much or have disregarded other things. Forgive me, I don't know if what you call these things, but one of my young granddaughters, Lyra, she's learning to ride a bike, and on her little bike she has extra wheels at the back. We call them stabilizers. And I think that what God has done in pandemic is he's removed the stabilizers from many of our churches. And for many of our churches, the stabilizers have been their buildings and their corporate worship gatherings. And we, just as Lyra is having to learn how to ride a bike without the stabilizers, I think the challenge that many of our churches is facing is how do we be church when we can't meet together? This is UK context. When we can't meet in our buildings and we can't have our corporate gatherings. You know, if you have a wedding here now, you're limited to 15 people. If you have a funeral, you're allowed 30 people, and it's changing on a daily basis. I think the other thing the other things that have been illuminated is actually the spotlight has been on us by the consumerism that has so seeped into our churches. We've ended up as leaders running the church with all the pressures and programs and activities. To quote one of your American songwriters, Paul Simon, it's about trying to just keep the customer satisfied. And if you don't deliver what your people want, and if you don't open up your church like those people in your church want you to open it up, well, they'll simply they'll simply worship and go somewhere else. I think that's enormous pressure upon leaders. I think it's revealed a shallow discipleship, the dependency culture. I am dismayed and saddened, actually quite depressed by attitudes that I see among church members, adherents to the Christian faith, who've sat under teaching ministries, preaching ministries, been in home Bible groups, gone to conferences, But the pandemic has just kind of revealed I love the toothpaste in the tube illustration. It's like the pressure's on, and that's the stuff, the attritional attitudes and anger that has come out of people. I think it's highlighted our focus on the church, on the building the church, something we were never called to do. When I teach students who are training for ministry, your task is never to build the church. Jesus builds his church. Our task is to make disciples. And yet I think when we examine ourselves, we spend so much of our time building and managing the church. I think it's exposed, I just think it's exposed our endemic racism, the sectarianism and racism that is in our hearts, the sexism that is in our hearts and in our churches, our inability to live with diversity, the assumption that we live in a Christendom world, that we don't live in a plural society. So we become increasingly tribal in our attitudes. I think it's revealed our inability to speak truth to power. And all that has left so many church leaders that I speak to and relate with feeling bewildered, you touched on it, overwhelmed, fatigued, unprepared, stressed, depressed, left questioning what our calling and vocation is. I think it has exposed for all of us our insecurities, our inadequacies. It's raised questions about who we are and what we do individually and together in our churches. I was talking to a minister who was very honest, who was just saying, I just don't know what to do now. I just do not know what to do. If we don't go back into our building and I'm standing before my congregation, opening up the word of God and teaching, Roy, I don't know who I am or what I do any longer. And that was a really honest confession. I carry a fear, a real fear, that we're likely to end up as curators of a dying institution called the church, instead of being co-creators with God of a new world. Now, that's all pretty depressing. So let me give you some, there's a symbol in Japanese, often people say it's Chinese, but it's in Japanese, that the same symbol for crisis is the symbol for opportunity. And I think, when you try to discern what God might be doing, God is shaking the nations. There's no doubt about it. He's shaking the nations. And the church is being shaken to its core. And I've often been led in recent months to just thinking about the early church. You've got Acts 1 and 2, where in Acts 1:8, the Holy Spirit will come upon you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And day of Pentecost comes, Acts 2, the Spirit comes upon them. And what happens? They stay in Jerusalem because it's all really good stuff. And it's not until you get to Acts 8, when persecution comes upon the church, that they're scattered. And where do they go? Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Now, it's not persecution that has turfed us out of our buildings. It's a pandemic. But I just think in the good and loving purposes of God, that this situation God has used to turf us out to where we're supposed to be. In our neighborhoods, in our patches, among our communities, in our Judeas, in our Samarias, and to the ends of the earth. But there's no doubt about it, and I think it's really important in taking care of ourselves, is that we're able to give permission to just naming what's going on externally, but naming how that's impacting us. Everybody listening or observing, watching me now, I'm sure you could think or you could chant and say, I'm depressed, I'm stressed, I'm worried, I'm anxious. I don't know what to do. I wasn't trained for this. I want another job, although there aren't going to be too many jobs around after this. I wonder if I've got transferable skills. I mean, the pressure here in the UK upon church leaders who are having to respond to strong minority voices of people saying, we need to get back to normal, need to get back to normal. Folks, there is no return to normal. Anybody who says that, I would defy, I would worry about. I would actually think they're living in cloud cuckoo land. And the first task of leadership, according to the writer Max Dupree, which I love, it's my favorite definition of leadership. The first task of leadership is to define reality. And the reality is we're in a mess. The reality is we're at a crisis point. The reality is that for most of the church in the West, in the Northern Hemisphere, we are declining. In the UK, we have aging congregations. We don't have many people between the ages of, well, kind of 0 to about 50 years of age. That might be slightly different, but please take heed of what has happened here in Britain, because 40 years ago, we had plenty of those folks. 40 years on, we're elderly congregations, closing churches. And I think our inability to adapt, or our kind of heads in the stand ostrich spirituality, is an abandonment of the leadership to which God has called us to be leaders of his church in these changing times.